talk about food writing, and we are focusing on everything food writing related. So if you're interested in becoming a food writer or anything of the such, if you're interested in cooking in general, we all eat. Most of us write in some way or another, be it on social media or just to each other. And this is a good opportunity for you guys to learn from the professionals. So I have here with me these girls that are definitely professionals in their field. And I have some questions that I'm going to ask them. And I want to cover a lot of different stuff tonight. I want to talk about their professional histories and influences, and of course how things have changed for all of us over the years as far as food writing goes. So one of my first questions I want to ask each of you individually before we kind of span out is, what were your major influences on not just writing but cooking and food in general? So you want to start, Amy?
Sure, thank you, Susan. Welcome, all of you. So glad to be here with you. I actually lived in South Carolina for 12 years before I went off up north to North Carolina. So I've been Carolinian by choice for 28 or 30 years. So my approach to learning about my adopted home was as a writer who one day said, hey, food keeps showing up in my stories. Isn't that kind of interesting? And I decided to focus on that as a way to tell a story and then to approach other people to collect their stories and start putting things together in kind of ways that were new for me in this storytelling about food that sometimes has recipes and sometimes doesn't. In terms of people who influenced me, of course, you couldn't grow up in the time that you grew up and not see Julia Child on television and not see, back in the day, there was a book called the I Hate to Cook book. Does anybody remember that?
Peggy Brackett, right?
Peggy Brackett. And then there were all these other food humorists, these people like Bob Beck and really old school folks who spun the whole idea of the happy housewife kind of on its head. And I think that was always back in my head for a really long time. And fast forward to the 90s when I picked up a book called Home Cooking by an author named Lori Colwyn, Collwyn. And she was so funny and so observant and so opposite of high-minded that I said, I might be able to find a place to be in this world of everyday people just dealing with life and dealing with food.
All right, thank you very much. Carrie?
Well, for me, food was all I knew growing up. I spent a ton of time with my grandmother, not the one from Spartanburg, the one from Charleston. My father raised me. My parents got divorced when I was really young, so I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, and they did not have a lot of money, and her job was to feed her 5 sons. And I spent all of my free time when I wasn't in school at her waist, with her waistcoat, watching her cook. And the food was very simple. It didn't have anything to do with microgreens or anything fancy. It was fried bologna, angel biscuits that would last in the refrigerator for 3 days. It was a pot of rice always on the stove, mainly because those are the things that didn't cost a lot of money. And so I became very passionate about food at a very young age because I didn't know anything else, and that's what I did every day. I was with her. So I like to say that I am obviously a Southern food lover. Southern food made me passionate about food because that was my culture, but I am even more passionate about learning about other cultures now as I evolve in my culinary career, because there's such a rich history and tradition of Southern food that has made me want to learn about other cultures. So, thanks, Nana.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just to pause for a second. You mentioned one of your, in an interview I read from you about the matriarchs and what a big part they've played in a lot of our cooking and growing up and things, and how important that is. And I find it interesting that sitting on the stage, we're all women, whereas the restaurant industry is dominated by men, and whereas when you think of the home cook, it is often the woman. So I'm very glad that we are all able to sit here and talk about food.
well, all those male chefs, and they are fabulous, somebody had to cook for them, and that's what made them passionate about food, so.
Well, my husband cooks more than me. My biggest influence is actually my father. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and so I'm a northerner trying to understand southern food, which is a little bit different. So I always kind of feel out of step. It's definitely been an education. But my father was the type of guy who he would go on vacation and you'd ask him how it was, and he would tell you about every meal that he ate. And I had a kind of circuitous route to food writing. I used to cover courts. My first job was actually the courthouse reporter at the Greenville News. And then I went to Raleigh to be the courthouse reporter there. And I was the type of person who, to kind of get away from the drama that I was seeing in the courtroom, I would curl up at night with a cookbook. And I would eventually write food stories on the side for the food editor, and then kind of talked my way into that job when the person retired. So I got very lucky in that way. I realized that.
All right, thanks, girls. It's interesting the different ways that we've all been influenced. Now, I personally, my undergraduate degree was in history first before I went to culinary school. Now, Amy, your degree was in writing, is that correct? Speech. And then yours was in journalism, okay? You were elementary education. And I find it interesting that with these different degrees, these different backgrounds, how we've all ended up at this point. So if this is inspirational to anyone, you don't have to be the trained chef to be able to write about food. Like I said earlier, we all eat, and therefore you can all talk about food in general. And we were discussing something earlier about how we can use food to talk about everything. So in my column specifically, I tend to talk about the histories of food and the science and the stuff behind the food, because that's what interests me the most, and then explaining these things to make it easier to understand why you're doing what you're doing when you're in the kitchen. So I can approach from that direction, but I know that all three of you can approach in a different way. Andrew, do you want to talk a second about that?
I do, and I think I get, this is something I really wanted to make a point of saying tonight, which is that you can use the prism of food to tell all types of stories. They can be personal stories. I've written about struggling with my father's dementia diagnosis in a food column. I wrote a column this morning off the shootings in Chapel Hill this week, which was basically like hug your family and make them something good to eat. I've written about poverty and economic development. You can use food to tell any story. You really can, whether it's personal or a story about your community. And so I just want people to make sure that you realize it, that that's a way, that it's a medium that you can tell any story through.
Do you have anything to share about how the differences in your background can help you with the food and help you with the writing in general, maybe about the elementary education and that kind of thing in food and how that, and writing and business owning in general?
Well, the elementary education had absolutely nothing to do with my food career. But I was saying earlier that the elementary education for me was a great choice because I had to stand up in front of children and get them to pay attention to me, to like me, to believe what I'm saying. So ultimately it was a sales job for me. That's the way I like to look at it, and that's what I tell my father when he tells me that I chose the wrong major in school. But for me, food is what connects me to everyone. So I'm assuming that everyone is like this, but you never know. I mean, I go to work every day and I talk to my coworkers about what I made for dinner last night, or what are you going to make today? And you know, there's always an event behind whatever the meal is. There's a reason, whether it's I only have 30 minutes because I've got to get my 3 children to soccer, or I'm going to plan this big dinner party. And I think that if you were to really sit down and think about why you're preparing meals, there's always a story behind it. So I do not have a formal writing background. I'm not a food writer, so to speak, but I am a storyteller, and I love to entertain people, not with my words, but with my food. So for me, it was really easy to talk about the food that I make because I'm so passionate about giving something to someone or entertaining them with food. So that's kind of where I come from. So it's very passionate for me. I love to cook for people.
So on the same line of the entertainment, can you tell us a little bit, Amy, about your WFAEats and how you can use that for educational purposes as well as entertainment?
Yes, and I expect that later in the second half of the program we'll talk about writing as a career versus writing as a hobby, your passion, your paycheck, all those kinds of things. We'll get into this some more. I'm contributing editor for NPR station WFAE, which has an online food magazine called WFAEats. And the subtitle is All Things Food and Culture, where we write about pretty much anything that you can imagine if it has a food component, except restaurants. We don't write about restaurants, and people often say, well, what do you write about? And my answer is we write about everything else. We write about grandmothers teaching their grandchildren to cook. We write about how a home-cooked meal is the most comforting thing you can share with someone when there's a tragedy. And if you stop and think about things that are happening in your own life or that you observe in the world around you, chances are really, really good that there's a food component to that story. You do not have to be a journalist or an educated MFA creative art person to write about food. You just have to be able to tell a story. You have to be able to observe the story. And then you have to be able to put your thoughts in an order that tells something a little deeper than just the words on the page. And we'll talk some more about that also. So what we do at WFAEats is we publish slice of life stories about food. And they're all over the map. They're about getting stood up for a Valentine's Day dinner. As if it wasn't bad enough to get stood up on Valentine's Day. It was the dinner. We've written about breaking up with your grocery store. We write about farmers, growers. There are people who do food swaps. And of course, we do write about issues of social justice, how hard it is to afford food sometimes, how a lot of people are really struggling with getting enough good food. But these are all stories. And when you think of it as a story, remember, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. All of a sudden, it's once upon a time, we grew up, and then there's your story, and it starts to become a piece of food writing.
Excellent, and that's a good transition. So we can all tell stories. And we do all tell stories, even if it's just telling someone about your day. So if we talk about what we've eaten or what we want to eat or what we can create from something like that, that pretty much makes all of us food writers in a way. So if you have any interest in becoming a food writer in any way, so there are, of course, there's books, there's blogs, there's so many opportunities, even if you are writing for something on a professional level, something for a school, something for a newspaper, or if you're writing just for fun, just on the side, just for here's what I've done and share it with your friends. You all have the capability, and these days it's even easier for just the average person to become a food writer in their own way. So I want to kind of transition over into the first, the way things have changed for some of us with the transition from print to digital. So if you guys want to share any of your stories about how more print is less these days. So we have, it's not to say all obsolete, because we see so many cookbooks. We see people as a hobby collecting these cookbooks and things, and even magazines, all the material that we can get. What type of change have you felt personally in the food writing, in even like marketing your biscuits and things like that? Like what kind of thing have we seen just over the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What's the type of changes?
The biggest change for me, and I'm a newspaper reporter, but the biggest change for me is I'm no longer just responsible for producing good content. I have to get it in front of my audience. So I have to use social media and tweet endlessly and use Pinterest and Instagram and Facebook to get my stories in front of the people I want to reach. And that's the biggest deal. I mean, I am attached to this device. Like if it's not within reach, I feel like I've lost a limb. And you know, that's where these newspapers are going. I mean, increasingly numbers of our readers are coming from Facebook and Twitter. And so we are foolish if we think the future is putting that piece of paper in your driveway. And so that's kind of the biggest change for me. The other thing that I'm learning is I have to do everything. Like I have to take video, which I haven't been very good at. And I have to be able to shoot my own pictures. And I have to, we just launched a site called The Recipe, which is kind of our archive, photo-driven archive of our food. So it's not just that I get to write words about the dish, I have to present it in a way that makes people want to come and find it. Whereas that used to be divided up into other people's jobs, that's my job now.
Well, for me, I'm in my 10th year of starting and owning a specialty food business that was, until 6 months ago, only on the internet. So, when I first started Callie's Biscuits, just trying to figure out how I was going to get the word out, I had no choice. I had no print options. I had no brick and mortar shop. So I had to quickly learn about how to capture attention of whoever's out there. How do you get people to come to your website? It's great, you've got a website, now what? So someone said to me in 2005, you should write a blog. And I said, why would I do that? And she said, well, you cook all the time and people ask you for your recipes, and aren't you sick of having to give the same macaroni and cheese recipe out all the time? And I said, well, that kind of makes sense. And she said, well, look at it this way. You're constantly reaching out to people saying, buy my biscuits, buy this, buy that. Why don't you give something back to them? And that is what really connected to me. I thought, I love that idea because I could write about what I cook, and guess what? I don't really cook a lot of biscuits at home. And so I loved the idea that I was giving back something to my customer that had nothing to do with biscuits. It was just about my chicken that I cooked last week, or my macaroni and cheese that I cooked from my grandmother's kitchen. So I loved that part of it, and then from there it just grew. So digital for me was always on the forefront. I had no idea it was going to evolve into a print opportunity. So I kind of am backwards on that way, in that way.
I think what's key for me is I consider food writing part of the conversation that I'm having with you. So if you hear me on the radio or you visit our web blog magazine and you see something and it makes you want to respond with a comment or respond with a story, that is what has changed for me, that it's not anymore just this one-way thing that, as Andrea says, we put in your driveway every day. There's an opportunity for you to take part in it. There are people who rightly call it the wild, wild west because it is kind of lawless out there. It's not always controllable, but it does become a conversation so that when I put something out there about where do all the cookies go, everything in the grocery store is now fat-free, gluten-free, sugar-free, and taste-free. People go, yeah, and then people send me recipes and tell stories about why the cookies are disappearing, what they remember about what made a cookie good, and then we're having a cookie conversation that digs a little deeper into our sensibilities, what we value, our identities.
Nice. And I think that as we're seeing these changes, and as we are talking about it more amongst one another, this continues to broaden the spectrum. So we have folks that are interested in food writing, in becoming their own bloggers in the beginning, and here we end up with folks that do have cookbooks based on the fame that they receive from that. So you all started, at one point, we did not graduate high school and say we were going to be food writers, and yet here all three of you have cookbooks. So a lot had to go into that, and then we come into some of the technicalities of it. So I'm kind of interested in the takes that you guys have on how you got to the point where you actually have the book in your hand. So if those people out there are interested in actually having their own books, people are always saying you should put all these recipes together, you should give this out, you should publish something, have something in your hand. What led you guys specifically to having these books? And there's a lot that goes into it. I know we have to find editors and agents and publicists and all these little intricacies that the everyday person might not think of. What can you tell the listener as far as getting to this point, what you went through to have your name on that book.
Yeah, I want to hear your story.
Okay, well, before I answer that question, how many people in the crowd are considering writing a cookbook before I tell you the down and dirty details? Okay, well, that's good, because I was going to tell you to leave the room and I'd call you back in. For me, it was like birthing a baby. And so, you know, you're really excited in the beginning, and then you start to get the morning sickness, and then just the whole process until the very end, and then you see the baby, and you're like, oh, I forgot about the whole process, and it was fabulous, and I'm so glad I did it. It's like, you know, you're excited at the beginning, and then it's a long journey to get there. It's a lot of work, and I had a team of people helping me. I mean, I'm not a food writer, so that was not my specialty, but I had pieces of paper torn and ripped, and, you know, sticky notes, and, you know, halfway done recipes of, you know, hundreds of recipes that I've written over the last 5 years, and just kind of gave it to somebody and said, okay, what do we do now? You know, and had stories to go with everyone, because I've been writing this blog, and so I had a lot of help organizing it and figuring out how the chapter should go. But honestly, my favorite part was telling the story, and once we got the structure down, it kind of went somewhat smoothly in trying to figure out what direction you want to go as far as what your theme is for the book, and you know, how much of your life are you going to really divulge to? Who knows? I mean, you know, who knows who's going to read this book? So it was a very emotional experience for me, and if I didn't sell one cookbook, the most important part of it was that I was really true to the people that have inspired me in my life, and I wanted to leave something to my 3 children who, that's all I really cared about, is letting my girls know about my history and my heritage and Southern upbringing, and I want them to be inspired to do something that can hopefully, you know, I hope that they are passionate about what they do. So that was what was most important to me about the whole process.
And the recipe testing.
I hired a recipe tester. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And I worked with her every day, and she called me and she said, it's kind of scribbled, I can't see, is that like 1 tablespoon? I'm like, I don't know, I don't measure when I put salt and pepper in. And I thought that that's how everybody did. But, you know, one of my very best friends over here, Amy, would call me and say, is this 1 teaspoon of salt in this chicken? I'd say, I don't know. You'd have to hold the measure underneath when I'm sprinkling, because I am not a recipe writer, and I think most home cooks, which is what I consider myself to be, I don't even read recipes, actually. I don't have a lot of cookbooks. I have 2 or 3 cookbooks at home. I read them for the stories, but I don't read cookbooks and, like, cook with a cookbook, even if I'm inspired by a recipe. So for me to write a recipe was really a pain in the hiney. I did not like writing recipes ever. That was, and to this day, I don't like writing. In fact, I have somebody that works with me for my blog now, and I'm always saying to her, you should just come over, and I could do 5 recipes at once, and you could watch me and tell me what the measurements are, because it really kind of ruins the whole process for me to have to sit down and write when I'm cooking, because I love to cook, but I don't want to turn it into a science experiment. That's the not fun part. That's the work part of it.
Yeah, that's a good point, and there's so much that goes into transitioning what's in your head into putting it into words, and I think a lot of that is knowing your audience, knowing who you are hoping is going to pick up your book, but also knowing that there's going to be so many different people,
Right.
and different walks of their culinary knowledge that are going to be reading this, and how to break it down to the points where anyone can understand this to an extent. If you have to put in there specifically 2 eggs cracked, that's something else versus just putting eggs in.
Well, it's like watching an artist paint, not saying an artist, but it's like watching an artist paint a painting and then standing behind him going, okay, now how did you do that brush stroke, and what color was this hue of this? You know, that's a hard thing to do, so that's the work part of it.
Yeah, it is, and everyone has a slightly different style, and when we are describing our food, when we are putting it into writing, we can express that in different ways, and if you pick up one recipe or written by one person to another, it's all going to be different. So having to target the audience and know how to express that, I think, is a really important. Can't say that enough, just how important that is.
I want to hear Andrea talk about the Savor the South books.
Oh, yeah, so mine was a little, my situation was a little different. I was approached by a publisher. So UNC Press decided to come up with a series of single subject cookbooks. And so they asked me what would you like to do, and I said, I had a couple ideas, but the number one on my list was Pickles and Preserves. Because when I became a food writer in Raleigh, I had not been smart enough when I was younger to get in the kitchen with my grandmothers when they were canning, or my mother. But I sweet-talked one of my predecessors, who was a former food editor of the paper, to teach me how to can. And then I just started, it transformed my year. I was one of those people who, the day after Thanksgiving, was like, I am going to make all these Christmas cookies and cakes, and I'm going to have gifts for everybody at the holidays. And then 2 days before Christmas, these things would be showing up on my desk and on my doorstep, and I would have nothing to give these people. And when I started canning, that I had a pantry full of things to give people. It was awesome. And the work was spread out throughout the year. And so I absolutely knew that that was the book that I wanted to write. And I had a year to do it. And I was well trained by my readers about how to write a recipe, because if I ever looked at it down, you hear it. So it was crazy, because it was the first year of my daughter's life. And I'm like, how the heck did I do that? But they sleep a lot when they're that little. So that's how I did it. And it was much harder when she was running around like a toddler and I was trying to promote the book. That was much harder. But
That's painful.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. I don't know that I'd do it again right away. It's a lot of work.
And I'll just sum up by saying is, your book was like giving birth. My book was like building a house. I showed up one day, on a flat lot with a hammer and some nails and that's a very silly way to do it. You really can't do it that way. I'm a big believer in the incremental motion forward. You can't really decorate the rooms until you have a structure. You can't have a structure until you have a foundation. You can't have a foundation until you have a plan. So if your goal is to write a cookbook or to be the next Julia Child, and you've never done any kind of food writing whatsoever, I'm going to strongly caution you against that approach, because you'll make yourself and everyone around you just crazy. And you won't have very much pleasure. You'll feel all of the frustration, but very little of the satisfaction. So we'll talk again some more during the Q&A about ways you can start getting a structure built and ways you can start getting a foundation and a plan in place for the kind of writing that suits you, so that when you build your food writing house, it fits and suits you.
Excellent. All right, I believe we're going to take our break. Betsy, do you want to add anything to this?
Thank our panelists. That was a terrific session there.